Chapter 25. A Visit to Signor Pococurante, Venetian Nobleman. Candide and Martin got into a gondola which took them down the Brenta to the palace of the noble Pococurante. The gardens were well laid out and adorned with beautiful marble statues, and the palace was an architectural triumph. The master of the house, a wealthy man in his early 60s, received his two visitors with great courtesy but very little enthusiasm, which disconcerted Candide and did not displease Martin. Two pretty, well-dressed girls served them with cups of frothy chocolate. Candide could not help praising their beauty, graciousness, and dexterity. "They're rather pleasant girls," said Senator Pococurante. "I sometimes take them to bed with me, because I'm tired of the ladies of the city, with their coquettishness, jealousy, quarrels, moods, pettiness, pride, and foolishness, as well as the sonnets you have to write or have written for them. But those two girls are beginning to bore me too." Later, as they were strolling down a long gallery, Candide was surprised by the beauty of the pictures he saw. He asked which master had painted the first two. "They're by Raphael," said the senator. "I paid a high price for them several years ago out of vanity. They're said to be two of the finest paintings in Italy, but I don't like them at all. The colors are too dark, the figures aren't well shaded, and don't stand out enough, and the draperies don't look at all like cloth. In short, no matter what anyone may say, I find no true imitation of nature in them. I'll like a painting only if it makes me think I'm seeing nature itself, but there are no such paintings. I have many pictures, but I no longer look at them." Pococurante had a concerto performed before dinner. Candide found the music delightful. "That noise may be amusing for half an hour," said Pococurante, "but if it lasts any longer it bores everyone, although no one dares to admit it. Music nowadays is nothing but the art of composing and performing difficult pieces, and things that are merely difficult never give lasting pleasure. I might like an opera more if they hadn't managed to make it into a monstrosity that revolts me. Anyone who wants to can go to see bad tragedies set to music, in which the scenes are written only to give flimsy pretexts for 2 or 3 wretched songs that show off some actress's windpipe. I have nothing against those who are willing or able to swoon with pleasure when they see a eunuch warbling the part of Caesar or Cato and moving awkwardly around the stage, but for my part I have long since given up such pitiful nonsense, which is now the glory of Italy, for which sovereigns pay such large sums." Candide argued a little, but with discretion. Martin agreed with the senator wholeheartedly. They sat down to table. Then, after an excellent dinner, they went into the library. Candide saw a magnificently bound Homer, and complimented the illustrious nobleman on his good taste. "Here's a book," he said, "that used to delight the great Pangloss, the best philosopher in Germany." "It doesn't delight me," said Pococurante coldly. "I was once made to believe that I enjoyed reading it, but that constant repetition of combats that are all alike, those gods who are always active but never do anything decisive, that Helen who's the cause of the war but almost never appears in the story, that Troy which is forever besieged but never taken, all those things bored me to tears. I've sometimes asked learned men if they found the book as boring as I do. Those who were sincere all admitted that it put them to sleep whenever they tried to read it, but said that a man must always have it in his library as a relic of antiquity, like those rusty coins that can't be placed in circulation." "Your Excellency must have a different opinion of Virgil," said Candide. "I admit," said Pococurante, "that the 2nd, 4th, and 6th books of his Aeneid are excellent, but as for his pious Aeneas, his stalwart Cloanthes, his faithful Achates, his little Ascanius, his idiotic King Latinus, his vulgar Amata, and his insipid Lavinia, I can't think of anything colder or more unpleasant. I prefer Tasso and Ariosto's cock and bull stories. May I take the liberty of asking you, sir, said Candide, if you take pleasure in reading Horace? He wrote a number of maxims which a man of the world can put to good use, said Pococurante, and the fact that they are expressed in lively verse makes them easier to remember. But I care very little for his journey to Brundusium, or his description of a bad dinner, or his uncouth quarrel between a man named something like Publius, Pupillus, whose words, he says, were full of pus, and another man whose words were vinegar. I read with extreme distaste his coarse verses against old women and witches, and I don't see what merit there can be in telling his friend Maecenas that if he places him in the ranks of lyric poets, he'll strike his sublime forehead against the stars. Fools admire everything in a celebrated author. I read only for myself, and I like only what suits me personally. Candide, who had been brought up never to judge anything for himself, was astonished by what he was hearing. Martin found Pococurante's way of thinking quite sensible. "Oh, here's a Cicero," said Candide. "Surely you never tire of reading that great man?" "I never read him," replied the Venetian. "What does it matter to me that he pleaded for Rabirius and Cluentius? I have enough cases of my own to judge. His philosophical works would have suited me better, but when I saw that he doubted everything, I concluded that I knew as much as he did, and that I didn't need anyone's help to be ignorant." "Ah, here are 80 volumes of the Proceedings of a Scientific Academy," exclaimed Martin. "There may be something good in them." "There would be," said Pococurante, "if only one of the authors of that hodgepodge had invented even the art of making pins. But in all those books there are nothing but vain systems, and not one useful thing." "Look at all those plays," said Candide, "in Italian, Spanish, French." "Yes," said the senator, "there are 3,000 of them, and not 3 dozen good ones. As for those collections of sonnets, which all together are not worth 1 page of Seneca, and all those fat volumes of theology, I'm sure you can understand why they're never opened by me or anyone else." Martin saw some shelves filled with English books. "I think," he said, "that any Republican would enjoy reading most of those works written with so much freedom." "Yes," replied Pococurante, "it's a fine thing to write what you believe. It's the privilege of man. In Italy we write only things we don't really believe. Those who live in the country of the Caesars and the Antonines don't dare to have any idea without the permission of a Dominican. I'd have a high regard for the freedom that inspires the English thinkers if everything admirable in that precious freedom weren't corrupted by passion and party spirit." Candide noticed a Milton, and asked the senator if he regarded that author as a great man. "Who?" said Pococurante. "That barbarian who makes a long commentary on the first chapter of Genesis in 10 books of rough verse? That crude imitator of the Greeks who disfigures the creation, and who, instead of representing the eternal being creating the universe with his words, makes the Messiah take a big compass from the cupboard of heaven to draw up a plan of his work? Do you expect me to admire a man who spoils Tasso's hell and devil, who disfigures Lucifer sometimes as a toad and sometimes as a pygmy, who make him say the same things over and over again, who makes him argue about theology, who seriously imitates Aristotle's comic invention of firearms and makes the devil's fire cannons in heaven? Neither I nor anyone else in Italy could enjoy those pitiful absurdities. The marriage of sin and death, and the snakes which sin gives birth to, are enough to sicken a man with any delicacy of taste." And his long description of a hospital would please only a grave digger. That obscure, grotesque, and disgusting poem was despised at its birth. I now treat it as it was treated in its own country by its author's contemporaries. Furthermore, I always say what I think, and I don't care whether others agree with me or not. Candide was distressed by these statements. He respected Homer and had some liking for Milton. Alas, he whispered to Martin, I'm afraid this man may have utter contempt for our German poets. There wouldn't be much harm in that, said Martin. Oh, what a superior man, said Candide under his breath. What a great genius this Pococurante is. Nothing can please him. When they had thus gone over all of Pococurante's books, they went downstairs to the garden. Candide praised all its beauties. I know of nothing in such bad taste, said the master of the house. There's nothing here but worthless trifles. But tomorrow I'm going to have work begun on a more nobly designed garden. When the two visitors had taken leave of his excellency, Candide said to Martin, Well, you'll have to admit that there's the happiest man alive, because he's above everything he owns. Can't you see, said Martin, that he's disgusted with everything he owns? As Plato said long ago, the best stomachs are not those which reject all foods. But, said Candide, isn't there pleasure in criticizing everything, in being aware of defects where other men see beauties? Do you mean, said Martin, that there's pleasure in having no pleasure? I suppose not, said Candide. In that case, I'll be the only happy man in the world when I see Lady Cunegonde again. I always hope. It's always good to hope, said Martin. Days and weeks went by, however, and Cacambo did not come. Candide was so deeply immersed in his sorrow that it did not occur to him that Paquette and brother Giroflée had never even returned to thank him. Chapter 26. How Candide and Martin had supper with 6 foreigners, and who they were. One evening, as Candide and Martin were about to sit down to table with the other foreigners who were staying at their inn, a man with a soot-colored face came up behind Candide, took him by the arm, and said, Be ready to leave with us without fail. Candide turned round and saw Cacambo. Only the sight of Cunegonde could have surprised and delighted him more. He was nearly mad with joy. He embraced his dear friend, and said, Cunegonde must be here too. Where is she? Take me to her. Let me die of joy with her. Cunegonde isn't here, said Cacambo. She's in Constantinople. Good heavens! Constantinople, but I'd fly to her even if she were in China. Let's go. We'll leave after supper, said Cacambo. I can't tell you any more than that. I'm a slave. My master is waiting for me. I have to go and serve him at table. Don't say a word. Eat your supper and be ready. Candide was torn between joy and sorrow. He was delighted to see his faithful friend again, and astonished to see him a slave. He was filled with the idea of finding his mistress again. His heart was agitated, and his mind was in turmoil. He sat down to table with Martin, who regarded all those adventures with detachment, and with 6 foreigners who had come to Venice for the carnival. Cacambo, who had been pouring wine for one of the 6 foreigners, leaned close to his master's ear toward the end of the meal, and said to him, Sire, your majesty may leave when he wishes. The ship is ready. Having said these words, he left the room. The others, sitting around the table, were looking at each other in astonished silence, when another servant came up to his master and said to him, Sire, your majesty's carriage is at Padua, and the boat is ready. The master made a sign, and the servant left. The others looked at each other again, and the common surprise redoubled. A 3rd valet came up to a 3rd foreigner and said to him, Sir, believe me, your majesty mustn't stay here any longer. I'll make all the preparations. Candide and Martin were by now convinced that they were witnessing a masquerade that was part of the carnival. A 4th servant said to a 4th master, Your majesty may leave when he wishes, and went out as the others had done. A 5th valet said the same thing to a 5th master, but the 6th valet spoke differently to the 6th foreigner, who was sitting near Candide. Sire, he said, they won't give any more credit to your majesty, or to me either. and we may both be in jail before the night is over. I'm going to take care of my own affairs. Goodbye." When all the servants had disappeared, Candide, Martin, and the 6 foreigners sat in deep silence. It was Candide who finally broke it. "Gentlemen," he said, "this is an odd joke. Why are you all kings? For my part, I confess that neither Martin nor I are kings." Cacambo's master replied gravely in Italian, "I'm not joking. My name is Ahmed III. I was a great sultan for many years. I dethroned my brother, and my nephew dethroned me. My viziers were beheaded. I am now finishing out my life in the old seraglio. My nephew Sultan Mahmud sometimes allows me to travel for my health, and I've come to Venice for the carnival." A young man sitting beside Ahmed spoke next. "My name is Ivan," he said. "I was once emperor of all the Russias, but I was dethroned while I was still in the cradle. My parents were placed in confinement, and I was brought up in prison. I'm sometimes given permission to travel, accompanied by my guards, and I've come to Venice for the carnival." The third said, "I'm Charles Edward, King of England. My father ceded me his rights to the throne, and I fought to maintain them. The hearts of 800 of my followers were torn out and thrown in their faces. I was put in prison. I'm on my way to visit my father, a dethroned king, like my grandfather and myself, and I've come to Venice for the carnival." The fourth then spoke, "I'm the King of Poland. The fortunes of war deprived me of my hereditary dominions, and my father suffered the same fate. I've placed myself in the hands of Providence, like Sultan Ahmed, Emperor Ivan, and King Charles Edward, to whom God grant long life, and I've come to Venice for the carnival." The fifth said, "I'm also King of Poland. I lost my kingdom twice, but Providence gave me another realm in which I have done more good than all the kings of the Sarmatians put together were ever able to do on the banks of Vistula. I've also placed myself in the hands of Providence, and I've come to Venice for the carnival." It was now time for the 6th monarch to speak. "Gentlemen," he said, "my lineage isn't as illustrious as yours, but I was once a king like any other. I'm Theodore. I was elected King of Corsica. I was called Your Majesty. Now I'm scarcely called Sir. I had money minted, and now I'm penniless. I had 2 secretaries of state, and now I have only 1 valet. I once sat on a throne, and for a long time I lay on a bed of straw in a London prison. I'm afraid I may be given the same treatment here, even though I've come to Venice, like your majesties, for the carnival." The 5 other kings listened to this speech with noble compassion. They each gave King Theodore 20 sequins with which to buy clothes, and Candide presented him with a diamond worth 2,000 sequins. "Who is this ordinary private individual," said the 5 kings, "who can afford to give 100 times as much as any of us, and actually gives it?" As they were leaving the table, there arrived at the same inn 4 serene highnesses, who had also lost their dominions through the fortunes of war, but who had come to Venice for the remainder of the carnival. But Candide paid no attention to these newcomers. His mind was occupied solely with going to Constantinople to find his dear Cunegonde. Chapter 27. Candide's Voyage to Constantinople. The faithful Cacambo had already spoken to the Turkish captain who was going to take Sultan Ahmed back to Constantinople, and obtained his permission for Candide and Martin to come aboard his ship. They both embarked after prostrating themselves before his miserable highness. On the way to the ship, Candide said to Martin, "We've just had supper with 6 kings, and I even gave charity to one of them. There may be many other princes who are still more unfortunate. As for me, I've lost nothing but 100 sheep, and I'm hurrying to Cunegonde's arms. Once again, my dear Martin, Pangloss was right. Everything is for the best." "I hope so," said Martin. "But what an unlikely adventure we've just had in Venice," said Candide. "No one ever saw or heard of 6 dethroned kings having supper together at an inn." "That's no more extraordinary than most of the things that have happened to us," said Martin. "It's quite common for kings to be dethroned, And as for the honor we've had of eating supper with them, it's a trifle that doesn't deserve our attention." As soon as Candide was on board the ship, he threw his arms around his former valet, his friend Cacambo. "And what is Cunegonde doing now?" he asked him. "Is she still a prodigy of beauty? Does she still love me? Is she in good health? Have you bought her a palace in Constantinople?" "My dear master," replied Cacambo, "Cunegonde is now washing dishes on the shore of the Sea of Marmora for a prince who has very few dishes. She's a slave in the house of a former sovereign named Ragatsky, who's taken refuge in Turkey and is living on a small allowance given to him by the Grand Turk. But what's even sadder is that she's lost her beauty and become horribly ugly." "Ah, whether she's beautiful or ugly, I'm an honorable man," said Candide, "and my duty is to love her forever." "But how can she have been reduced to such a state with the 5 or 6 million you brought her?" "First of all," said Cacambo, "I had to give 2 million to Signor Don Fernando de Ibarra y Figueroa y Mascarenes y Lampurdos y Souza, governor of Buenos Aires, for his permission to take Lady Cunegonde away. Then a pirate expertly robbed us of all the rest and took us to Matapan, Milos, Icaria, Samos, Patras, the Dardanelles, Marmora, and Scutari. Cunegonde and the old woman are working in the house of the prince I told you about, and I'm the dethroned sultan's slave." "What a terrible series of calamities," said Candide. "But after all, I still have a few diamonds, so I'll easily deliver Cunegonde. It's a pity she's become so ugly." He then turned to Martin and said, "Which of us do you think is the most unfortunate, Emperor Ahmed, Emperor Ivan, King Charles Edward, or I?" "I have no idea," said Martin. "I'd have to be inside your hearts to know." "Ah," said Candide, "if Pangloss were here he'd know, and tell us." "I don't know what scales your Pangloss would use to weigh the misfortunes of men and judge their sorrows," said Martin. "All I presume is that there are millions of men in this world who are 100 times more unfortunate than King Charles Edward, Emperor Ivan, and Sultan Ahmed." "That may well be true," said Candide. A few days later they reached the Bosporus. Candide began by buying Cacambo's freedom at a very high price. Then he and his companions boarded a galley without delay and set off for the shore of the Sea of Marmora to find Cunegonde, however ugly she might be. Among the galley slaves there were 2 who rowed very badly, and the Levantine captain occasionally gave them a few lashes on their bare shoulders. Candide naturally looked at them more attentively than the others, and went over to them with pity. Certain features of their disfigured faces seemed to bear a slight resemblance to those of Pangloss and that unfortunate Jesuit, that Baron, Lady Cunegonde's brother. This idea troubled Candide and saddened him. He looked at them still more attentively. "Really," he said to Cacambo, "if I hadn't seen Dr. Pangloss hanged, and if I hadn't had the misfortune to kill the Baron, I'd think they were these 2 men rowing in this galley." On hearing the names of Pangloss and the Baron, the 2 galley slaves uttered a loud cry, sat still on their benches, and dropped their oars. The Levantine captain rushed up to them, and the lashes rained down more heavily than ever. "Stop, sir, stop!" cried Candide. "I'll give you as much money as you want." "What? It's Candide!" said one of the galley slaves. "What? It's Candide!" said the other. "Is this a dream?" said Candide. "Am I awake? Am I really in this galley? Is this the Baron I killed? Is this the Dr. Pangloss I saw hanged?" "Yes, it is," they replied. "Tell me, Levantine captain," said Candide, "how much money do you want for the ransom of Lord Thundertentronckh, one of the most eminent barons of the empire, and of Dr. Pangloss, the most profound metaphysician in Germany?" "Dog of a Christian," replied the Levantine captain, "since these 2 dogs of Christian galley slaves are barons and metaphysicians, which is no doubt a high rank in their country, you'll have to give me 50,000 sequins for them." "You'll have it, sir. Take me back to Constantinople with the speed of lightning, and you'll be paid on the spot. But no, take me to Cunegonde." After hearing Candide's first offer, however, the Levantine captain had already turned his ship toward the city, and was making his slaves row it faster than a bird cleaves the air. Candide embraced the Baron and Pangloss again and again. "How is it that I didn't kill you, my dear Baron?" he asked. "And you, my dear Pangloss, how is it that you're still alive after being hanged? And why are you both on a Turkish galley?" "Is it true that my dear sister is in this country?" asked the Baron. "Yes," replied Cacambo. "I've found my dear Candide again," cried Pangloss. Candide introduced them to Martin and Cacambo. They all embraced each other and began talking simultaneously. The galley was flying. It was already in the harbor. A Jew was summoned, and Candide sold him a diamond worth 100,000 sequins for 50,000. The Jew swore by Abraham that he could not give more. Candide immediately paid the ransom of Pangloss and the Baron. Pangloss threw himself at his liberator's feet and bathed them with his tears. The Baron thanked him with a nod and promised to pay him back the money at the first opportunity. "But is it possible that my sister is in Turkey?" he asked. "Nothing is more possible," replied Cacambo, "since she is now washing dishes for a prince of Transylvania." 2 other Jews were then summoned. Candide sold more diamonds, and they all set out in another galley to deliver Cunegonde.